Reading The Science of Self-Realization, the book by His Divine Grace Srila A.C. Bhakti-Vedanta Swami Prabhupada. Chapter number 1, Learning the Science of the Self. The essay entitled The Art of Dying. Shri Shukadeva Goswami, who was asked for direction by Maharaja Parikshit, responded to the king's relevant inquiries by advising him as follows. Tasmad Bharata Sarvatma Bhagavan Ishvaro Hari Shrotavyah Kirtitavyascha Smartavyasche Chata Bhayam. Quote, O descendant of Bharat, it is the duty of mortal man to inquire about, hear about, glorify, and meditate upon the personality of Godhead, who is the most attractive person because of his fullness in opulence. He is called Hari because he alone can undo the conditional existence of a living being. If we at all want to be freed from conditional existence, we must make relevant inquiries about the absolute truth, so that he may be pleased to bestow upon us perfect freedom in life. Unquote. Srimad Bhagavatam 2.1.5. Shri Shukadeva Goswami has particularly used four words in regard to the absolute personality of Godhead. These words distinguish the absolute person, or Parabrahman, from other persons who are qualitatively one with him. The absolute personality of Godhead is addressed as Sarvatma, or all-pervading, because no one is aloof from him, although not everyone has this realization. The personality of Godhead, by his plenary representation, resides in everyone's heart as Paramatma, the Super Soul, along with each individual soul. Therefore, every individual soul has an intimate relationship with him. Forgetfulness of this eternally existing intimate relationship with him is the cause of conditional life since time immemorial. But because he is Bhagavan, or the Supreme Personality, he can at once reciprocate the responsive call of a devotee. Moreover, because he is the perfect person, his beauty, opulence, fame, strength, knowledge, and renunciation are all unlimited sources of transcendental bliss for the individual soul. The individual soul becomes attracted by all these different opulences when they are imperfectly represented by other conditioned souls. But the individual soul is not satisfied by such imperfect representations, and therefore he perpetually seeks the perfect one. The personality of Godhead's beauty has no comparison, nor do his knowledge and renunciation. But above all, he is Ishvara, or the Supreme Controller. We are at present being controlled by the police action of this great king. This police control is imposed upon us because of our disobedience of law. But because the Lord is Hari, he is able to cause the disappearance of our conditional life by giving us full freedom in spiritual existence. It is therefore the duty of every man to make relevant inquiries about him and thus go back to Godhead. Jai. Soul research. Next section is called Soul research. In 1972, a distinguished panel met in Windsor, Ontario, and discussed problems associated with attempts to define the exact moment of death. Panel members included world-famous heart surgeon Dr. Wilfred G. Bigelow, Mr. Justice Edson L. Hines of the Ontario Supreme Court, and J. Francis Liddy, President of the University of Windsor. Dr. Bigelow upheld the existence of the soul and urged systematic research to determine what the soul is and where it comes from. Dr. Bigelow's and others panelists' comments were later published in the Montreal Gazette. When the article came to the attention of Srila Prabhupada, he wrote a letter to Dr. Bigelow offering substantial Vedic knowledge of the science of the soul and suggested a practical method for scientifically understanding it. The Gazette article and Srila Prabhupada's response follow. Gazette headline: Heart surgeon wants to know what a soul is. Windsor. A world-famous Canadian heart surgeon says he believes the body has a soul, which departs at death, and theologians ought to try to find out more about it. Dr. Wilfred G. Bigelow, head of the cardiovascular surgery unit at Toronto General Hospital, said that, quote, "As a person who believes there is a soul, he thought the time had come to take the mystery out of this and find out what it is." Unquote. Bigelow was a member of a panel which appeared before the Essex County Medical Legal Society to discuss problems associated with attempts to define the exact moment of death. The question has become vital in the age of transplants of hearts and other organs, in cases when the donors are inevitably dying. The Canadian Medical Association has produced a widely accepted definition of death as the moment when the patient is in coma, responds to no stimulus of any kind, and brain waves recorded on a machine are flat. The other members of the panel were Mr. Justice Edson L. Hines of the Ontario Supreme Court and J. Francis Liddy, President of the University of Windsor. Bigelow, elaborating on points he had raised during the discussion, said in an interview later that his 32 years as a surgeon had left him no doubts that there is a soul. Quote, "There are certain cases where you happen to be present at the moment when people pass from a living state to death, and some mysterious changes take place." Continuing with the quote, "One of the most noticeable is the sudden lack of life or luster in the eyes. They become opaque and literally lifeless. It's difficult to document what you observe. In fact, I don't think it can be documented very well." Unquote. Bigelow, who became world-renowned for his pioneering work in the deep freeze surgical technique known as hypothermia, and for his heart valve surgery, said soul research, in quotes, soul research, should be undertaken by theology and allied disciplines within the university. During this discussion, Ledi said that, quote, if there is a soul, you are not going to see it. You are not going to find it, quote, unquote. Next quote. If there is a principle of vitality or life, what is it? The problem was that, in brackets, the soul doesn't exist anywhere specifically, geographically. It's everywhere, and yet it's nowhere in the body. Next, it would be, quote, it would be nice to start experimenting, but I don't know how you're going to get on any of these things, unquote, Ledi said. He said that the discussion reminded him of the Soviet cosmonaut who returned from space to report there was no God because he didn't see him up there. Maybe so, said Bigelow, but in modern medicine, when something was encountered that could not be explained, in quote, the watchword is discover the answer. Take it into the laboratory, take it somewhere where you can discover the truth, unquote. The central question, said Bigelow, was, where is the soul and where does it come from? Okay, so Srila Prabhupada gives the Vedic evidence. My dear Dr. Bigelow, please accept my greetings. Recently I have read an article in the Gazette by Ray Carelli entitled, quote, Heart Surgeon Wants to Know What a Soul Is, unquote, and it was very interesting. Your comments show great insight, and so I thought to write you on this matter. Perhaps you may know that I am the founder Acharya of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. I have several temples in Canada, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, and Hamilton. This Krishna consciousness movement is specifically meant to teach every soul, his original spiritual position. Undoubtedly, the soul is present in the heart of the living entity, and it is the source of all the energies for maintaining the body. The energy of the soul is present all over the body, and this is known as consciousness. Since this consciousness spreads the energy of the soul all over the body, one can feel pains and pleasures in any part of the body. The soul is individual, and he is transmigrating from one body to another, just as a person transmigrates from babyhood to childhood, from childhood to boyhood, from boyhood to youth, and then to advanced old age. Then the change called death takes place, when we change to a new body, just as we change our old dress to a new dress. This is called transmigration of the soul. When a soul wants to enjoy this material world, forgetting his real home in the spiritual world, he takes this life of hard struggle for existence. This unnatural life of repeated birth and death, disease and old age can be stopped when his consciousness is dovetailed with the supreme consciousness of God. That is the basic principle of our Krishna movement. As far as heart transplant is concerned, there is no question of success unless the soul is there in the heart. So the presence of the soul has to be accepted. In sexual intercourse, there is no soul. If there is no soul, there is no conception and no pregnancy. Contraception deteriorates the womb so that it no longer is a good place for the soul. That is against the order of God. By the order of God, a soul is sent to a particular womb, but by this contraceptive, he is denied to that womb and has to be placed in another. That is disobedience to the Supreme. For example, take a man who is supposed to live in a particular apartment. If the situation there is so disturbed that he cannot enter the apartment, then he is put at a great disadvantage. That is illegal interference and is punishable. The undertaking of, in quotes, soul research would certainly mark the advancement of science. But advancement of science will not be able to find the soul. The soul's presence can simply be accepted on circumstantial understanding. You will find in the Vedic literature that the dimension of the soul is 1/10,000th the size of a point. The material scientist cannot measure the length and breadth of a point. Therefore, it is not possible for the material scientist to capture the soul. You can simply accept the soul's existence by taking it from authority. What the greatest scientists are finding, we've explained long ago. As soon as one understands the existence of the soul, he can immediately understand the existence of God. The difference between God and the soul is that God is a very great soul, and the living entity is a very small soul. But qualitatively, they are equal. Therefore, God is all-pervading, and the living entity is localized. But the nature and quality are the same. The central question, you say, is where is the soul and where does it come from? And that is not difficult to understand. We have already discussed that the soul is residing in the heart of the living entity, and that it takes shelter in another body after death. Originally, the soul comes from God, just as a spark comes from fire, and when the spark falls down, it appears to be extinguished. The spark of soul originally comes from the spiritual world to material world. In the material world, he falls down into 3 different conditions, which are called the modes of nature. When a spark of fire falls on dry grass, the fiery quality continues. When the spark falls on the ground, it cannot display its fiery manifestation unless the ground is favorably situated. And when the spark falls on water, it becomes extinguished. As such, we find 3 kinds of living conditions. One living entity is completely forgetful of his spiritual nature. Another is almost forgetful, but still he has an instinct of spiritual nature. And another is completely in search of spiritual perfection. There is a bona fide method for the attainment of spiritual perfection by the spiritual spark of soul. And if he is properly guided, then he is very easily sent back home, back to Godhead, wherefrom he originally fell. It will be a great contribution to human society if this authorized information from the Vedic literature is presented to the modern world on the basis of modern scientific understanding. The fact is already there. It simply has to be presented for modern understanding. Yours sincerely, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. Jai. So, we have completed chapter number 1. Tomorrow we're starting chapter number 2, entitled Choosing a Spiritual Master. So thank you so much for tuning in today. This was Shravanam Diaries podcast and your host, Sulalita Devidasi. The link to this book is in the description. And we shall see you tomorrow. Hare Krishna.